Today, though, I'm really thrilled to have Jacques Pauwels with us. The event is really coordinated around a book that literally just came out. I haven't even had a physical copy in my hands until today, called The Myths of Modern History. And we can circulate it, everybody can take a look at the table of contents. I also, and I don't get a cut for this, but I encouraged Jacques to bring copies, and there's two of each. This is mine, so nobody did this one. But there's two of this book, and then one of Jacques'. It's actually the first book that I read by Jacques that really blew my mind. I didn't know who he was. He was just a historian who came across my radar. But The Myth of the Good War is, I think, the best account of World War II that I've ever read, hands down. And so we can circulate, maybe I'll circulate one of each. People can take a look at them. Okay, yeah. Either way, yeah. And I'll introduce Jacques a little bit in a little bit greater detail here. So Jacques has a background in political science and in history. I'm going to ask him one of the first questions that I want to engage with him about is his own intellectual itinerary, how he's come to his objects of analysis, and what the stakes are of not only this book, but of some of his earlier research. I'll give a shout out to a few of the other books that he's written. The Great Class War, I think, is also an unbelievable introduction, not only to understanding World War I and its international significance, but also the entire lead up to World War I, because even though the book is kind of a book on World War I, what you get is a very condensed version of the history of the European world, primarily, from the French Revolution up to World War I. And so the stage setting that he does is really incredible, and it's also highly accessible. So that if you're not a historian, you don't have any specialization in the 19th century, I think there's some of the best works for that kind of introductory, kind of primer on the last 200 years of history. Another book that I really appreciate by Jacques, and I'm not going to name all of them here, is Big Business and Hitler. Especially in our moment in time when I think most people agree that there's a rise of authoritarianism and fascism around the world, that we're in a historical conjuncture that resembles, to a certain extent, the historical conjuncture of the interwar period. We really need to understand what the history of fascism is all about, and part of Jacques' work is also a political economy of that. So you look at the driving forces that were funding the rise of the Nazis and the rise of the fascists in Italy and elsewhere, for that matter, across the capitalist world. So for today's session, what I thought I would do is I have about 10 minutes of presentation that I want to give, because I know Jacques' work relatively well. I've learned an enormous amount from it, and I'd like to share with you what I think the real strengths of his particular approach are. And then I have a set of questions, and Jacques and I will kind of dialogue about his work, and more specifically about this book. We're going to try to keep that, as I said last time, to une petite heure, and try to keep it as dynamic as possible. And we're going to have at least an hour for questions from everyone here and from the people online. So a few quick points regarding, I think, the major strengths of Jacques' work. One is that a lot of the people who are trained in history academically tend to be trained in mega specializations that mean that you focus on, 2 months in Bretagne from, within the peasant class, and that's it, which is great for some historians and some forms of research. But when you do these types of history, it's really hard to see the broader picture and how specific historical events are connected to the larger kind of framework, both historically and geographically. And what I like about Jacques' work is that he's a specialist, and I'm sure if you want to ask him questions about the Battle of Stalingrad or other details, he'll share more with you than most historians would. But he has an incredible power to abstract in a concrete sense, right? Not an intellectual or theoretical sense, but abstract from the particulars so that we can see the macro historical forces and connect individual events in a kind of dialectical fashion so that you can see how the particular is always nested within the general, and you can move back and forth between the two. So that if you are a generalist and you don't have a lot of specialization in history, you can be given a broad map. But if you're a specialist, like I am to a certain extent in doing a lot of work on history, you can read Jacques and learn a lot about the details. So it's a great dialectical combination between the particular and the universal, so to speak. The second thing is that I would situate Jacques' work, I'll let him do it himself in a moment, in a tradition that Domenico Losordo referred to as counterhistory. And what counterhistory does, I'm thinking of Losordo's great book, Liberalism, A Counterhistory, which I couldn't recommend more strongly, is that like Losordo, like Annie Lacroix, like some of the other major historians of the modern age, is that Jacques, like these figures, recognizes that history is a political issue through and through. And if you want to control the present and intervene in it and try to seize some power to navigate where the world is going in the future, you have to understand the past. But the problem is that within the dominant ideology, within the capitalist core, the past has been controlled by those who own the means of intellectual production. And so much of what is presented to the public as history, if it be through textbooks or through mass education, or for that matter through the media, through documentary films, through Hollywood, etc., is propaganda through and through. And so what counter-history does is it knows the propagandistic narratives, it takes them seriously, but it mines down into the concrete evidence undergirding those histories and shows that those histories are pure propaganda. And therefore orients us in this kind of counter-historical direction where that evidence is taken and reframed. So it's not just a critique of propaganda, right, where it's saying, well, it's all wrong, it's all wrong. It's taking the evidentiary basis and reframing it for a positive historical project. To say, this isn't what happened, this is what happened. And the Myths of Modern History, I think, is structured very much in a kind of point-counterpoint fashion that does that, like the essay that we shared with you on democracy. The third point that I think is really powerful in Jacques' work is its resolutely international perspective. Anybody in the field of history knows you got to be a historian of France or a historian of Europe. You can't be a historian of the world. And we all have our limitations, right? We all have our centers of gravity, the languages we speak, the cultures we know, etc. And so Jacques' work is centered on the capitalist core, on Europe and the United States, but colonialism is at the center of everything that he does, right? So the understanding of the capitalist core is an understanding of its colonial adventures internationally, and that international perspective really means that we're given a kind of geography that is not the standard geography of the kind of siloed discipline of history in which everything is isolated and cut off. A fourth element that I think is really powerful is the transdisciplinary approach that he takes. So in reading Jacques, you'll get history. You get a lot of history in a, not exactly a traditional sense, but you'll find a lot of facts and a lot of narratives explaining those facts. But you also find a lot of political economy. You'll also find a history of culture and of the arts. In his book on the Great Class War, in fact, it's kind of punctuated by different artists and poets and what they were doing and how they were relating to the things that were going on in the songs and the revolutionary songs and things like this. So it's an attempt to take account of the social totality, not just politics separated from economics or separated from the broader social cultural world. And one of the last things that I'll highlight is that Jacques really centers class struggles in the plural, right? It's not a reductivist history, it's not a history that's saying there's just one driving force and that's it. But class struggles in the sense that there are different class forces that are really central to understanding history. The aristocracy, and the history of the aristocracy, which isn't dead and gone, which continues to be operative in various ways. The class force of the capitalist ruling class as it has emerged and now become dominant in certain sectors of the world, and the class force of the working class, right? But these class struggles, as Lasordo has demonstrated in his analyses of Marx, are not only about class in this particular sense, but also the struggles around who counts as a person, who is someone who is considered a valid actor within the political and social realm. And so I already mentioned that colonialism is central, and imperialism is central to all of Jacques' work, but so is the racial question, and the racialization of humanity and the subhumanization of humanity, and how that relates to these class struggles, as well as gender issues and sexual issues, which I hope we'll revisit in some capacity based on some of the things that came up last time. And so I could say more about this, but that's probably at least a good start. The first question that I have for Jacques is, I'd really like to get a sense of your intellectual itinerary, right? What has brought you to this way of doing history? And how does it relate more specifically to this most recent book? And I'd love to hear you on what the goals of the book are and why this book is important for our particular historical moment. So I'll let you press your button and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriel. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting project, this workshop, which touches all kinds of interesting topics. And like I said, I'm flattered, I'm honored And it's a pleasure to be here and to share a bit what I know about, or think I know about history, and what I think may be useful information and a useful approach to a lot of the students and academics present here. So you said a lot of nice things about my book, so I better say nice things about, about myself. My background is perhaps important, even though in some ways it's not, but I am originally from a very different background than people who read my books might think. I did not do history. I'm not a Marxist who decides to do history and look for basically ways to shore up my belief system. It's totally different. I come from a background that was not Marxist, not at all, but rather very, I should say, conservative and clerical, because I was born right after the Second World War. People ask me sometimes, where were you during the war? Well, I wasn't around yet. I told my parents to wait to have me born in 1946. In fact, I calculated that I was probably part of the celebrations of the end of the war. So I was born 9 months after May the 8th, 1945. So I think my father, he had already 5 children, and I was not expected anymore, but here I am.
Exciting times,
exactly.
right?
Exciting times. So I was born at that time, and then I grew up in the 50s, but I was too young to experience the bad part of the suffocating 50s, which was, of course, the time of the emerging Cold War. And from what I got as a child, from what I got was that the Cold War was very much in the air, And I lived in a small village in Flanders, which was then extremely Catholic and clerical and conservative. Now there were people who thought differently. Apparently in Ghent there was a working class, there were socialists, and communists. We heard about these guys, but nobody had ever seen one, There was no television yet to show how bad they really were. But anyway, so we were brought up in a very clerical environment, and being in Flanders, I was born in Ghent, and some of you may know Jacques, who had a wonderful song, Entre les tours de Bruges et Gand, between the towers of Bruges and Ghent, 2 beautiful medieval cities. That's where I was born. I could see the towers of Bruges on one side, and Ghent on the other side. And Flemish nationalism is today a big deal, and it's a part and parcel of the extreme right, and even the not-so-extreme right in Belgium today, very nationalistic, racist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, all of that. Well, that's the kind of baggage that was then flogged, basically the kind of intellectual ideas that were flogged big time, by the system, including the educational system, which of course was a Catholic school. And don't get me wrong, we got a good education, but it was very biased, obviously. And what I'm saying is that being brought up there and seeing the towers of medieval cities around you, the Middle Ages was a golden age, and it was Catholic age, Christianity, and the Crusades. Man, the Crusades, that was great. And we were the good guys, right? And them was the really bad guys, and yes, we sucked to them. We took Jerusalem, right? Nobody ever talked about how we massacred everybody. Later on we had to get out of there, Forgot about that, right? So history was already manipulated, but I didn't find that out right away. And then in the history of Flanders, there's one battle fought in 1302 where an army of Flemish militias of the cities actually defeated a royal French army at Courtrai. That was like, wow, fantastic. We, the Flemish, defeated the French. Whoa! Turned out, actually, it was a class war, a class battle. Because on the French side, it was Flemish speakers, and on the Flemish side, there were French speakers, namely the aristocracy that was French speaking, you know what I mean? So it was not like the way it was presented to us. But I just want to tell you, again, the background, I gobbled all that stuff up, big time, right? And so there was no question in our mind that in the Cold War, the Americans were the really, really good guys who had liberated us, and the Soviets were monsters, and then in the Middle Ages, we were the good guys, the Crusaders, the Flemish beating the French, and the church, of course, the glory of the church, and Joan of Arc and all that stuff, And I was lucky to be the youngest one of 6 because my older sister became nuns, in that atmosphere, right? And I lived through the 60s and saw light, well, saw a little bit of the light. Meaning, I decided after high school, which is Catholic, to go to the university, State University, and study history. Because my history at that time, I was only interested in medieval history, and I was convinced I was going to do more medieval history. But when I got to the university, one of our professors was John Donne, who was quite a specialist in social economic history. He got me interested in 19th century history, and I became aware of the working class movement, of strikes, of socialism, the First International, Karl Marx, people that I basically had never heard about, And I found that quite interesting. It opened my eyes. And my first time that I became aware of the importance of class relations in understanding history was when Professor Dunt explained not so much the class struggle in terms of an upper class against a working class, but of another aspect of the class struggle, which Domenico Losurdo, in his book on Lotta di Classe, which I strongly recommend, I don't know if it's out in any language, class struggle. That class struggle is not just an upper class against lower class. It's also intra-class struggles. It also involves women's struggle for women's emancipation and so on. And so at that stage, he explained how basically our thinking is not just sort of does not follow the sky and causes us to do things. It's the way we do things that makes us think differently. So the materialist approach to history and the class struggle approach, because he explained how, for example, at the time of the French Revolution, how the aristocracy were basically the landowners, and as such they had their worldview and their way of thinking, corroborated, backed up, basically of which the ideology was provided by the church. And in the middle class, that was the business class, the industrialists and bankers who had different activities, different ways of developing their wealth, and developing social prestige, and therefore thought differently. How the one side ended up thinking conservatively in a Christian way with the church on their side, and the other side opted for liberalism, the market economy, and all that stuff. And that was something like I had never heard of before, right? And to me, these were pretty basic, pretty simple. But that's got me to realize that this was actually something to it. That was interesting. So I did my thesis, my undergraduate thesis in Ghent University on strikes in the 19th century. And already I started at that stage, started to feel a bit of sympathy for what we call the socialism, which really meant social democracy, right? And then, for sick reasons which I won't get into, I ended up in Canada in '69. I didn't really want to emigrate, didn't think I was going to emigrate, but I ended up there for a bit of a fluke. And when I was there, I decided to continue my studies, and I ended up doing a PhD in history. And that's when I started to do, German history, the Third Reich. And that's why I took some American and Canadian history on the side, which we knew nothing about, because most Europeans that study know there's too much European history already. I mean, there's French history, British history, and all that. And by the time you got, all we knew of the United States was, to become independent at one point. There was a guy called George Washington or something, And then they had a problem with civil war, and that involved slavery, I believe, But they abolished it, and then they came in and saved us in the First World War. And then they came in again and saved us in the Second World War. And then they fought the bad guys in Korea, they fought the bad guys in Vietnam, and we were so happy that every day they killed a couple 100,000 Viet Congs, because that was wonderful in the context of the World War. But I changed my view then as I started to study the history. And that's when I discovered guys like Gabriel Kolko and the revisionist historians in the United States that told me a different story that I had never heard before, right? So that was a big thing, right? And at the same time, then I started to study Nazi Germany, and there was a German guy, that professor, an authority in the history of the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich, that presented what I would say now, kind of a Marxist approach. That was Reinhard Kühnel. The name may not ring a bell here, but it's K-U with 2 dots, H-N-L. And then I read George Lukács, on the Zerstörung der Vernunft, on the destruction of reason. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, then I started to realize this is a whole different ballgame, really. And I discovered then, also, gradually, not only Marx and his class analysis and all that stuff, and I remember reading George Lukács also, and about the German philosopher of the 19th century, reading about, for example, Feuerbach, whose philosophy comes down to the one wonderful sentence, man ist, was man ist. We are what we eat. Meaning what we do, what we eat, how we survive, is what makes us think in a certain way, right? And I've taken that myself to, I shouldn't say to some extremes. I apply that same idea. For example, in a book I wrote recently, it's not out yet in English, on the history of French wine, which is one of the topics I like, and I have a sip of water to prove it. I prefer wine most of the time. In a book I wrote about the history of wine, I explained why Christians drank wine and Muslims don't drink wine. And I didn't discover that. It's in a wonderful book, if anybody's interested in that, by an American anthropologist called Marvin Harris. Okay, and it's a fantastic book. I mean, really superb. And you have to read that book, right? Marvin Harris, and there's a number of books here written. And I interpret actually the Crusades as a struggle, a conflict between enophiles, people who like wine, versus enophobes. And the enophiles were at the same time porcophiles, like pig meat, pork, and enophiles versus porcophobes, people who don't eat pork. There's reasons, there's serious reasons why in the Middle East and North Africa you should not drink wine, or it's better not to drink wine, and why it's better not to eat pork, and why in Western Europe, where it's cold and damp and also water cool, how it makes sense to drink wine, it makes sense to eat pork. Now that's a way too simplistic a way to presenting it now, but I'm just saying how you can come to a totally different kind of understanding of an historical reality, which seems to be in the conventional aspect, just say, well, that's just the way it is, you know, Christians drink wine and Muslims don't drink wine, you know. But why did Muhammad say that his followers don't drink wine? You know, why did that make sense? You know, and why did the message of Muhammad then cease to be relevant and cease to appeal when it reached a certain area, you know, where people had always drank wine, had always eaten pork? So this is, again, one of these ideas that I take back to the idea of man ist was man ist, the German philosopher, you know, who was one of the neo-Hegelians who inspired Marx. But perhaps the greatest discovery in my trajectory, is when I discovered that Lenin was also a great intellectual. Because Lenin was also another monster of my youth in terms of history. But Lenin, my God, you know, a bad guy, right? Doesn't even worse than Stalin, of course. But I mean, Marx was already like bad enough, but he was just intellectually bad. But he hadn't really done that many bad things. But Lenin was not only bad because he was a revolutionary, but he actually made a revolution. Imagine that, you know. Revolutionaries who don't make revolution are quite acceptable, as you may know. But the ones that actually do make a revolution, especially a successful one. Because martyrs are okay too. Allende is fine, you know. As long as they die, that's okay. Our press, our media will maybe say some nice things about them. But it's successful ones that are not so popular. So then I realized that Lenin was very important because he developed the theory. Well, not only did he actually make the revolution, but he developed the theory of imperialism. And that is actually, he updated Marx, when an update of Marx was absolutely necessary because of the expansion of capitalism from a originally European phenomenon to a worldwide phenomenon. And imperialism is a worldwide manifestation, aggressive, acquisitive, worldwide manifestation of the European phenomenon called capitalism. And that is something you have to understand, and how it affected the world, right? What it did to the global south, the third world as we call it, right? To the colonies, right? And what it did to the people inside Europe. And here I want to flag another book for you. It's by Jacques. It's called Divided World, Divided Class. Does anybody know it? No. It's a fantastic book. It was published about maybe 10 years ago. Jacques, C-O-P-E. He's a British historian. And he explains the idea, which Lenin also already was aware of, you know, of the labor aristocracy. Of how a large segment of the working class in Europe, in the capitalist, the imperialist core countries, actually benefited from the expansion of capitalism worldwide. And how the super profits generated in the colonies and the exportation of misery that made it possible, right? And the robbery of these countries, of all the stealing of all their resources and accumulating that caused super profits, which allowed the upper class in Europe to throw some little crumbs on the table, you know, to appease the demands of the working class. Right? And that's a fantastic insight. I mean, and even imperialists at the time were aware of that. Cecil Rhodes at one point said, if we want to avoid civil war, he meant revolution, we've got to have imperialism. It's the only way, because also it gives jobs. So it created the possibility for lower class people to go lord it over inferior people over there. I mean, think of how many Irish or Scottish young men who had no future at home made it a sergeant, joined the victorious British armies that knocked the socks off the people in India, right? And similarly with the Belgians, I'm from Belgium, right? I mean, the Congo was like, hello, you know, that was if you wanted to go somewhere, you could become a teacher or a professor or whatever, or in the military, right? Or you could become a missionary. A missionary, my God, one of the farmers' families with too many children. I mean, there was only one who could inherit a farm. Well, off you go to the missions, you know, and you could lord it over people, you know, and you were you were the lord of the town, right? And in fact, that's just the way it worked. So in that, then, that is one of the only ways to understand the problem of racism today. Because the way they present racism to us is that it's fell from the sky. When you are or you're not racist. And you should change your mind and stop being a racist. But racism is a material basis for racism. The material basis is this. People in the core countries, ordinary people, now got better food on the table, have slightly higher salaries, even a certain social benefits, thanks to imperialism. So at the expense of people in the third world, right? And the misery was exported from Europe and magnified by being exported. I mean, as people in Belgium were better off, I mean, millions of people in the Congo became much worse off. And people in the core countries kind of knew that, and they had to rationalize that, right? So how do you rationalize it? You rationalize the poverty of these people by, they're just not as smart as we are. They don't have that drive that we have. They're not as beautiful as we are. They're not as smart as we are. They're a bit lazy, They just don't have that je ne sais quoi that we have plenty of, right? That's why, thank God, that they have us to teach them a little civilization, We share the benefits of our knowledge and civilization, and we know better. And eventually, years from now, they may catch up. That was also the basis of the theory of underdevelopment, that we have developed, to the top, because we're bright, we're the first ones on top. And the others, they will follow eventually, but there's no rush, But the idea that we got to the top as we pushed them down, that never occurred to it. Just like the very wealthy never realize that their wealth is due to poverty. That wealth, accumulation of wealth, creates poverty. Poverty makes wealth possible. And great wealth makes great poverty possible. There's a dialectic right there, right? And that is what comes out. That's all of that. If you don't understand imperialism, you can't begin to understand that. But what I'm saying then is that racism started there. So the idea of just simply saying, stop being a racist, well, as long as we have imperialism and we have the exploitation of the global south, we'll have racism. Because we have to justify it ourselves, right? And at the same time, racism is also fear of the other. Because knowing that in a way, you're participating, you're co-guilty of a great crime for which these people may someday come and get you. In the form of terrorism, for example, right? And that's why, there's always the fear of the other that they may actually want revenge sometime, which is a very real concern, of course. So it's this situation of worldwide, of capitalism having expanded worldwide and become imperialism that is the cause of much, not all, but much racism today. And that's what we have to understand. So to me, that was a great discovery. And I think today, in the social sciences, I'll stop in a minute, in general, whenever these things are discussed, there's also a big elephant in the room that nobody notices, and that's imperialism. Because nobody ever wants to talk about imperialism. It's as if imperialism doesn't exist. Oh yeah, well it was England in the 19th century, yeah, Victoria, yeah. And Napoleon, France was imperialist under Napoleon, empire, But the idea that capitalism is imperialist, that basic Leninist idea, that's a no-no. That is not to be discussed.
Can I jump in? I'm curious, part of your, work that focuses on, that focuses on then the ways in which fascism, in the European sense that it took in the interwar period, rose in part, obviously within this imperialist context, because Lenin was diagnosing imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, end of 19th, early 20th century. How would you, in the most succinct fashion possible, describe what fascism is and how it relates both to imperialism and then also to what you were alluding to, and that was the struggle on the part of colonized people to liberate themselves from imperialism?
Well, fascism arose after the First World War, and fascism actually is a form of capitalism. A lot of people don't know that, but Nazi Germany was a capitalist Germany. Most people fall over when you say that. They think that the Nazis confiscated all the wealth of the poor German industrialists and the bankers, and forced them to do all kinds of things which they didn't really want to do, Didn't really want to build airplanes and guns, no, but they had to, And they weren't even paid for it. The reality is that they created a Hitler because they wanted a war, and they made S-loads of money from that war. And after the war, they blamed all Hitler. How convenient. And the guy's dead. thank God, right? But if failing that, we can also blame it on all the Germans that were fascists. That's a good idea. Either just one guy and he's dead, or it's all the Germans. And then a German banker or capitalist who is known to have made lots of money thanks to Hitler is no more guilty than a dock worker in Hamburg who wrote the boats. Simple as that, right? So that's the advance. But fascism was created by capitalism, just like imperialism. And in fact, fascism is a form of imperialism. Fascism is a way to fight the class struggle at home and in the colonies. And do in some ways repeat the formula of imperialism that Britain, France, Belgium and all that stuff had applied magnificently to Africa. Apply it elsewhere if you have to. For example, Mussolini was a fascist. Italy had not done so well in the imperialist rat race and expansion, but Mussolini basically promoted an Italian imperialism and did a wonderful job, didn't they, in Libya, for example. People don't know that, of course, no clue of all the atrocities committed by these nice Italians. There's a wonderful book, by the way, about in Italy, about Brava Gente. Does anybody know it? By De Luca, an Italian historian, De Luca, who talks about the awful war crimes committed by the Italians. I like Italians. I think they're nice people, most of them. But like every people, there's good guys and there's not so good guys, right? The Italians committed awful war crimes in Libya, in Somalia, in Ethiopia. And I'm just saying, and so Mussolini, fascism, and that is the primordial fascism was Mussolini's movement, right? That's where the name fascism came from, right? Was about repressing any remaining revolutionary feelings in the working class. And I say remaining because most of them had given up on the revolution, having having sampled the goodies that fell off the table of imperialism. Most of the social democrats gave up on the revolution, right? But some didn't, and these were the followers of the examples set by Lenin and the boys in Russia, right? The communists, who still remained revolutionary. And that remained a concern in capitalist core countries, especially when the Soviet Union existed, to give guidance and support to these guys, right? So to beat down those guys, that's where fascism comes in, right? Mussolini's squadristi were basically set up to beat the, out of the commies, right? Or any Reds, right? And it's true that it was the same thing. The Nazis, the stormtroopers were set up to beat the hell out of the commies, right? And the Social Democrats and everybody else. But fascism was also there to promote imperialist adventures. And to promote them, justify them, and to recruit folks for it. To basically to stimulate enthusiasm for that, right? Typically fascist parties were all for, no sympathy whatsoever for these inferior people out there. In fact, one of the core ideas of fascism is total racism, that we are on top and should be on top, and all the other buggers are on the bottom and deserve to be on the bottom, and should be kept at the bottom, should be beaten down if necessary, right? Except perhaps when it suits our immediate needs. And what I mean is this: for example, German fascism, Nazism, despised any Slavs, okay? Despised the Poles, the Yugoslavs, the Russians, the Ukrainians. But when Ukrainian nationalism proved to be useful for anti-Russian, anti-Soviet purposes, then they were good guys. The big illusion of Ukrainian nationalists is that the Germans then and the Americans now care for them, like them, want them to be independent. Hello, wake up and smell the coffee, right? It's just simply not true. They're simply being manipulated big time. Hitler had no use for the Ukrainians, but he supported the Ukrainian fascists, including mass murderers, including war criminals galore, because they were useful for anti-Soviet purposes, right? But did these people really think that if Germany would have won the war, that there would have been room for an independent Ukraine? Of course not. Of course not. Britain had plans to colonize the East with German colonists. That was it. There was like a settler colonialism that he had in mind. So that is why, then, to come back to the point, that fascism was also was uber racist, and as such it was again perfectly useful for imperialist ventures and imperialist adventures. Yes.
And can you situate that, because a lot of people, I think, and this relates to your work on World War II, don't understand the centrality of the Soviet Union in World War II itself, and specifically the relationship between Nazi Germany and the Wild Wild East, as they refer to it. as well as the role of the Soviet Union in ultimately defeating Nazism?
Well, that is one of the major topics of the history of the interbellum, the interwar years, and the Second World War, the relationship between the capitalist/imperialist world on the one side and the Soviet Union on the other one. The Soviet Union was the black beast of the Western world for two reasons. First of all, it promoted a revolution at home, right? I mean, and they had done it themselves. They talked about a revolution, they carried out a revolution, and contrary to what the expectations, the country did not collapse after a few years. In fact, it developed, became stronger in the 30s, as the capitalist world became weaker because of the Great Depression, which caused a lot of people in the capitalist world, including the United States, to say, to think, to believe, to start to believe that the end of capitalism was near and the future is red. It's going to be like Russia. And in fact, most people don't know that, but there was a lot of people that emigrated from the United States, including black people, to Russia, because there was jobs in Russia. It was a job to be done. There was jobs to build a new society. You know? And a lot of people, I saw on TV recently a program interviewing the descendants of black Russians whose ancestors were immigrants, who had fled, so to speak, depression-ridden United States in the 30s, and found jobs and were welcomed and did not suffer from racism, right, in the Soviet Union. Right? So that the Soviet Union then had not only made a revolution, but it seemed to be on the way to succeeding, while the Western capitalist world was going through a major crisis, right? And that encouraged a lot of Reds in the United States, the 30s, or the dirty 30s because of the bad economy, but also the red 30s because of all these Reds that actually came out of the woodworks, as they had always been out of the woodworks ever since the French Russian Revolution. There were all the black Bolsheviks and so on. And that meant that capitalists like Henry Ford and the boys perceived the red menace to be real, They were really, really worried, okay? And that was also true in France and elsewhere. So how do you counter the red threat? The answer is no more Mr. Nice Guy, all right? No more democracy, but an iron fist fascism. Fascism. Like, look at Mussolini, look at Franco. And they brought in the fascists. The fascists were, fascist movements were financed, promoted, cuddled by bankers and industrialists, right? And where possible, brought to power. And I say where possible, because it wasn't always possible. And where it didn't prove too risky, because it was sometimes risky. The first attempt in Germany to follow the example of Italy and bring a fascist dictator to power was in 1923 when Hitler tried the beer hall putsch. Thought the time was right, but he didn't get the support he needed. Why not? Why not? Because the same year already, there had been a year before, so there had been a similar attempt by the military to take over the country. And actually, the commies and the socialists, the social democrats had gotten together, a major strike, a major revolutionary movement, and those plotters got the hell out of there as fast as they could, because everyone was afraid that it might switch into a red revolution, right? So the risk of bringing the fascists to power would always involve the risk, or the attempt involved the risk of a reaction from the working class, of a kind of a common front, and maybe a general strike. So careful what you do now. And this is why in some countries they didn't, but in most countries they did bring in dictators. There, sometimes the choice was between an old-fashioned military dictator of the old style, or the fascists. The fascists were a better choice, because they were more trendy, They managed to get some support, to get mass rallies. These old-fashioned dictators, the military guys, like the Francos, didn't get much popular support. Mannerheim in Finland, Pilsudski in Poland, These were old-fashioned kind of monarchists, aristocrats, seemed to be have to be not of the people, right? But the fascists talked populist language. Fascists typically were of the people, but for the upper class, right? But they allowed the upper class to sit back, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and let this little guy with the mustache do the talking. And he'll do the job. And we can say it's one of yours. You guys want democracy? You got it. So fascism was useful for that purpose of putting down the threat, eliminating the threat of revolution at home, and also then of encouraging more imperialism abroad. And here is where specifically the case of Germany is important, because Germany didn't have colonies. Germany lost whatever colonies it had before the war. And many Germans, including Hitler, basically dreamed of a great major mega uber colony similar to India for Britain, similar to the Wild West conquered by the United States, right? Where they wiped out as much as possible the local yokels, or actually made them slaves, right? And then the land was yours, you know? Right? And that's the idea, and they dreamed to do that in Eastern Europe. That meant Eastern Europe. The land of the Slavs. Well, the hell with the Slavs, the hell with the Jews. Out they'll go, and we'll come in. We'll settle it with Germans, right? Settle the colonialism. And that's why, and that was the big dream. So
and also the Soviet Union, right? To crush the Soviet Union.
So there was a double whammy, right? Essentially, Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union, or he explained very clearly in Mein Kampf, published in 1922, was to wage war and destroy the Soviet Union for two reasons. First of all, to wipe out communism in its own lair, right? To kill the monster dragon in its own lair, and therefore you probably kill world communism, right? And secondly, to offer German industry, German capitalists and bankers, an uber colony where you can get all the stuff that the Brits have in India, the Belgians in the Congo, and more than that. You know, the land, the fertile land of Ukraine, the oil wells of the Caucasus, you know. I mean, all that will be yours, you know, all that will be yours. Look, son, someday none of this will be yours. It's my father said.
You know, Jacques, one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about is because depending on how much people know about Soviet history or world history, oftentimes when the Soviet Union's brought up, the standard concept that's used is totalitarianism, right? That fascism and communism are the same thing, and therefore that class struggle and what you're alluding to gets written out of the equation. And so I'm curious if you could just say a little bit more about, without getting into any great detail, but the Soviet Union had a project of workers' emancipation, but it was also invested in class struggles across the board, right? As you've written on, if it be the question of the colonial question, if it be the women question and the question of gender and sexuality,
right.
If it be the racial question.
Yes.
How does, I guess, historical reality regarding Soviet Union struggles relate to the totalitarian image that is so widespread that collapses it into fascism, ultimately? Well, or a form of fascism.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I understand the question very well, but it's a fact that when the Soviet Union experimented and with all kinds of what we call today democratic innovations, right? I mean, for the working class, but also for women. I guess the Soviet Union was the first country that basically emancipated women legally and provided all kinds of benefits to women, including equal pay and so on. It was not a consistent rectilinear kind of progress, because in the 30s, for reasons which we won't get into, it didn't quite continue as smoothly as it did in the 20s. And then of course there was the war and all that stuff. But the Soviet Union, the Soviets did something not only for the working class, and we think of white men working in factories and on farms and in coal mines and so on, but also for women, for working women, including pregnancy benefits and leaves for their work, paid leaves and so forth. Right? But the Soviet Union's one of the big sins in the eyes of the Western world was also that they supported the independence movements in the colonies. The Baku Conference already in 1919 it was, right? And in fact would from the beginning would support the independence of the colony, and that was something for which the West would never forgive the matter. But now to come back to totalitarianism, the theory was developed in the 1950s, basically to somehow, as a weapon in the Cold War, to cause people to think differently about Nazism and communism, and to basically just say the two are exactly the same. But of course, they are total opposites. In fact, the two fought each other. They were the two great antagonists of the First World War were Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. And it's fair to say, so the Second World War were the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, some similarities cannot be denied. I mean, there was in the Soviet Union a high degree of regimentation, and of militarization. But you can understand the context. I mean, the Soviet Union had to defend itself. I mean, there was no illusion among the leadership of the Soviet Union, as early as Lenin and later on Trotsky and Stalin, that the West was not going to let them build up socialism, and support independence movements and say, okay, well, it's a free world, you do what you want. No way, no way, Jose. In fact, it was clear from the beginning. I mean, during the revolution already, the Allies sent troops. About 14 countries, the United States, Canada, Belgium, Holland, France, not Holland, sent troops to Russia to help the whites. That's the reactionary Tsarist forces, against the Reds, right? I mean, and the only reason why that didn't succeed, why that crusade didn't succeed, is because it became clear that the military and the civilians in these countries like Britain did not want anything to do with that. I mean, there were strikes at the dockers in places like Liverpool. They didn't want to load ships heading for Murmansk. And the soldiers that were sent there said, after 4 years of fighting this god-awful war that we didn't want, we now have to fight the Soviets. You fight. And in fact, over there, they deserted in large numbers. The French had desertions, and a lot of people ran over to the Bolsheviks, right? So that didn't work. So somehow, that first attempt to kill the revolution didn't work. But there was no illusions that they would try again. And in fact, Hitler from the start was seen as the great white hope of the Western world, right? And the Soviet Union had no choice but to rearm and invest a lot of its resources and basically create a strong army. And that is where, of course, that's where stuff going. I mean, there's no illusions about the time after the First World War. They were tough times, and danger was in the air, and war and aggression were in the air. And if you wanted to plan to survive in the next conflict, which was bound to come, you better be prepared for it. Yeah. You better basically focus on producing guns rather than butter, as one of the Nazis said. Right. And that's in that respect, being threatened on all sides. Michael Parenti, whom I admire a lot, and many of you may know, wrote about that socialism in the Soviet Union was a siege socialism. The Soviet Union from the beginning was a besieged fortress, whereby basically people were told that you have to obey, you have to do certain things that way, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, because we're threatened, And then of course there's certain outward similarities which are simply due to the fact that modern armies look the same way, but the uniforms, the machine guns, the tanks that parade either in Berlin or the Soviet Union, there's a lot of similarities. You could say the same thing about some of the military défilés in France. On the 14th of July, you would go down to Champs-Élysées, they won't have children waving flowers walking down, they have the military coming down, right? That's part of the tradition of the 20th century, and the 19th century already, right? So yeah, that is my view. One of the things, sorry, no, go ahead. You probably asked me the question about.
Well, no, I'm curious because we're almost an hour in, and so we've gone from imperialism and fascism and World War II and kind of part of the Cold War. I'm curious to kind of connect the dots to the more recent developments. One of the arguments that you've made is that the war on terror, which was, prior to the new Cold War, one of the dominant motifs that really defined the early part of the 21st century, that we have to understand the war on terror as a part of a class war. And so I'm curious if, some people, particularly with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, said, well, it's the end of communism, now it's democracy, end of history kind of thing, and then there was a new war and a pivot to the war on terror. So how can we understand the war on terror, particularly now that we're in the kind of new Cold War, in relationship to this deeper history of the battle between the capitalist/fascist forces on the one hand and actually existing forms of socialism on the other?
Well, we have to, I read a very long chapter in my book on the post-World War II era, right? And I see it as an advance for democracy from after 45. And then there's I see the advance democracy, the cause of democracy being advanced by the triumph of the Soviet Union, because the Second World War, let there be no illusions about it, was a victory of the Soviet Union, of which the other countries, United States, Canada, participated, shared, and made a contribution, don't get me wrong. But I mean, without the Soviet Union, the second language today here in Paris would be German, if not the first language. The fashionistas, I make the point sometimes, would probably walk up and down the Champs-Élysées in lederhosen, and you drink much more, you know what I mean? So, if the Soviet Union had not been able to stop Nazi Germany's attack in June 1941, Nazi Germany would have become the mistress of Europe and would still be so today. Right? Let that sink in for a moment. Because there's no way that the Allies would ever have been able to land troops in Normandy in 1944 if Germany would have conquered the Soviet Union. Because even as it was, in June 1944, when the Americans, British, Canadians, and whatever French forces were available landed in Normandy, they were up against less than 10% of the German army. And they had a hell of a time. Now, and not only that, not only did the Germans didn't have many men to fight, because they were all fighting for dear life on the Eastern Front. Right? But not only that, but if you see movies and you read books about the landings in Normandy, there's never a single German airplane in the sky. And why is that? They had jets, for Pete's sakes. Yeah, but they had no gas. They had no gas, right? Because the big objective economically, militarily, militaro-economic of the destruction of the attack on the Soviet Union was to get oil, petroleum. And the idea was to get the petroleum to the Soviet Union. And once you got that, basically, Germany has solved its big problem for winning the war, the shortage of fuel. And if they would have won in the summer of 41, as per the predictions in Berlin, London, and Washington, and elsewhere, that the war would be over within 4 months. And by the 1st of September 1941, the German army would simply be, the men would be sent back to the factories, right? And the Soviet Union would be exploited ad libitum by the German industry. And at that stage, Germany would have been so powerful that the Americans, who were in the war yet in 41, and the British could never have dreamed of landing troops and liberating Europe. It would have been totally impossible. And to this very day, Germany would have ruled the continent, as many people believed in 1941 already. You know, the turning point of the war was already in the fall of 41, right? It was not the landings in Normandy were not a turning point of the war at all. It was an afterthought. It was a footnote. And it was not even the Battle of Stalingrad, where victory for the Soviets was clear by February 1, 1943. It was in December 1941 already. His generals told Hitler that we can no longer win the war. And actually, they already started to get that feeling, that sinking feeling, within a month after attacking the Soviet Union in June 1941. And that made all the difference. That made all the difference. Why am I telling you that now? You asked, I was trying to answer.
No, it's really important, and I'm glad that we're going back to this, because most people don't realize that it was, 27 million Soviets who gave their lives fighting Nazi Germany, and 90% of the Nazi war machine was directed against the Soviet Union. The war was in the East, and the United States was dragging its feet before even entering the war and opening the Western Front. It took some 2 years, right?
That's right, yeah.
And the Soviets and others were begging them to enter the war, but they were holding back and waiting, and we know that many American officials were not sure what side of the war to enter on, right? Yeah. Allen Dulles, the feature head of the CIA, said that, well, why are we allying with the Soviet Union? We should be allied with the Aryan, pro-capitalist, Christian Nazis. And that's precisely what they did, and then recycling a lot of the Nazis in the post-war era. So I'm really glad that you touched on that, but the final thing, and then we'll open up, so begin gathering questions, and I'll take Stack here in a moment, and I think Constanze is doing the same, is I wanted to see if you could just connect that briefly before we open up to the War on Terror. How can we see continuities between the Cold War and the War on Terror?
Well, I now remember why I got talking about what I was talking about. Good. It's about when after the war, then what happened with the United States and its view of a war, and how indeed the war against terror would come about. The Second World War, you must understand, like all wars, a very complex historical development, historical issue. Right? The Second World War was 2 wars rolled into one. Okay? First of all, like the First World War, it was a struggle for supremacy within the club of the great imperialist powers. Okay, which had included the First World War, France, Britain, the Germany, of course, the Ottoman Empire, and then that First World War had not decided anything, because the British, the French had won, but were exhausted and basically pretty well deflated. Germany had lost, but was still very strong and very aggressive, and the United States and Japan had come up on the sidelines as as new eager beavers, right? So it had to be done all over again to see who was going to be the boss.
Yeah.
Well, the long and short is that Germany was a major candidate to come out as the boss. And had they won the war against the Soviet Union, they would have been the boss, okay? They would have been the boss, at least in Europe. And then maybe the United States would be the boss on the other side of the Atlantic, and Japan probably in the Far East. And Britain might have held on to its empire. That was Hitler's view of things, right? So what happened is that the German imperialism eliminated French imperialism, subordinated it, okay? The Americans, by getting involved in a war, against their will by the way, subordinated British imperialism through Lend-Lease. You know? Britain comes out of the Second World War as a junior partner to the United States, right? Finished as a great power, right? Japanese imperialism comes on real strong and then, you know, finished, subordinated to American imperialism. And the only serious threat to American supremacy now is Nazi Germany still. But Nazi Germany is eliminated by the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So one of the ironies of history is that the struggle for supremacy within the imperialist camp is decided in favor of the United States because the anti-imperialist Soviet Union defeats the competition, the Nazi competition. Think about it. Think about it. Now, you would think that the Americans would be very grateful, of course, and say to Moscow, you guys, thank you so much. We are so grateful for eliminating our big enemy, our big rival. But no, because the second war within the war is a war between imperialism and socialism, communism, anti-imperialism, Soviet Union. However, half of the imperialist camp is fighting, with them against German imperialism, right? But I'm just saying, it's still a war of imperialism, capitalism, against anti-imperialism. Most people never see it that way, but Nazi Germany is a capitalist country with great imperialist appetite and ambitions, right? And Nazi Germany is run by the capitalists and by the bankers. Hitler is just a guy that basically appears on TV. Well, no, I'm saying he just does what basically is expected of him, right? Yeah, so they are that is the problem then with the with imperialism is that it's a struggle between imperialism and anti-imperialism, and the victory of the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany is a victory of anti-imperialism, and that's a tremendous boost for all forces in, for example, the global South that fight for independence, that dream of independence and for a better fate for themselves, than being basically a colony of some big imperialist power. I mean, if the Brits give up India after the Second World War, why is it? Because they don't know that, not because of Gandhi being a nice guy and all that stuff, no, it's because there's an armed resistance as well, and it's clear that they're going to get the support of the Soviet Union, and the Brits realize that they can't hang on, and they throw in the towel. The French also have the same problem in Indochina, right? But they try to hang on, but they can't, because the popular support of a people in Indochina, energized by the victory of the Soviet Union and led capably by Ho Chi Minh and the boys, are unstoppable. So they get the French are beaten, the Dien Bien Phu have to get out, right? So basically, the colonies after the Second World War will be successful in basically emancipating themselves in gaining their independence, thanks to the success of the Soviet Union, basically against Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany being a big imperialist power, and the Soviet Union intended to become a colony, right? And that success, that the colony actually beats the imperial beast.
Yeah.
I mean, that is something that Mao's China also is inspired by that and supported. And the Soviet Union gives moral support and material support, right? Yeah. And that is what. So when the war ends, with those two wars, the one war is settled to the satisfaction of the United States. It comes out as the number one, numero uno, the supremo of imperialism. But the damn problem is that victory also means a victory for the anti-imperialist Soviet Union. Right. Well, you can't have that, sorry. Right? And that is why no sooner is the war over, a new war starts. No sooner is the Second World War over, and the Cold War starts. Because now you have to finish out the Soviet Union. In fact, it starts before the First World War is over, because Patton already wants to march to Moscow before the Germans even surrender. And you may or may not know that the British and Americans kept hundreds of thousands of Nazi troops in their uniforms, under their officers, ready to march with Patton to Moscow. That is a known fact. It's a known fact. And Churchill himself admitted that at one point, because they were actually, as some American generals were overheard saying to each other in the middle of the war, we are fighting the wrong war. We are fighting with the wrong enemy, the damn Ruskies, against the wrong enemy, the Nazis. We have nothing against the Nazis. Nazis are good capitalists, essentially like us. And the commies, the Ruskies, they're bad guys. We should have fought with the Nazis against the Red Army. And that's what was their dream. But now, so now that becomes possible. And not only is that becomes possible and desirable, it is going to be the big ambition of the United States for the next 30 years. But when it will suddenly lead to victory in 1990-something, right, when the Soviet Union will collapse, that's actually going to be a nasty surprise for another reason. For another reason. And that reason is that until 1939, 1940, the American economy is in the doldrums. You know, it's the Great Depression. It's the great economic crisis. And that means the reason for the crisis is that there's way much production, there's huge supply, and not enough demand, right? But the war picks up the slack of demand, boom, demand. And production goes up, and more demand. So during the war, you can produce any kind of truck or tank or airplane, and the war will use it. And the United States is a capitalist country. There's a lot of money to be made on that, right? Profits go up. And actually the working class that was red in the 30s, now because of strikes gets much higher wages than before, and stop being red, okay? Because they're now satisfied. They become like a labor aristocracy, like in Europe already because of imperialism, right? The war takes over the role of the function of imperialism, basically. It allows crumbs to fall off the table, right? So the war is magnificent for business. The war eliminates the Great Depression. But already as the war comes to an end, economists like Samuelson, you know, are warning that, the end of the war, that's going to be a big problem. Because suddenly there'll be no more orders. And millions of men are going to come back from the front looking for a job. And just when the factories are going to say, sorry, no more planes to produce, no more tanks to produce, holy shit, you know, that's going to be, the crisis is going to come back. And the Reds will come back. And especially now that the Soviets won the idea of revolution and rules and change, oh my God, can't prevent that. You know, the French have a saying, le roi est mort, vive le roi. The king is dead, long live the king. Well, they said something similar after the war. The war is over, long live the next war. You know, I mean, all we need is a good enemy. You know, so essentially, when the war is over, the enemy is there already. It's the Ruskies. You know, and we hate those guys anyways. Patton is ready to march. You know, and we have all these captive Nazis that are willing to march with us. Some of these guys we've kept, and they're in Ukraine today. You know that, right? You know that, don't you? I mean, we in Canada, after the war, accepted tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees who had collaborators of the Nazis, who had fought against the Soviets, committed huge war crimes in the process. They admired Bandera, who was their leader, and all that stuff. I mean, they were given passes, you know, and sins were forgiven, and they were settled, many of them in Canada, where we actually have today, in a couple of cities, monuments to SS units of the SS. And they were given big research centers in universities and University of Toronto and given shitloads of money to basically staff centers for Soviet studies, you know what I mean? Right? And they are there today.
Same thing in the US.
And you may or may not know that our wonderful leader, Justin Trudeau, well, that the second in command, Chrystia Freeland, is the granddaughter of a major Nazi promoter of Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, most people don't know that, you know. But if you mention, oh, that's all Putin propaganda, you must be a Putinist, right? But I'm just saying, so what happens is then that the Cold War picks up the slack, you know, of the end of the Second World War. And that then leads to a situation where suddenly the Berlin Wall comes down, and we lose that wonderful enemy, the Soviet Union. The United States is orphan of their wonderful and big enemy, you know. So how are we going to, and people like, I remember in those days, people expected a peace dividend. Yeah, we're going to have a peace dividend. Meaning, now we're finally going to be able to spend money for social services. Imagine that, social services in the United States, right? Imagine that, right? And goodies for ordinary people. Wow, and for the first time ever, right? I'm sorry, guys, we got a new enemy. Well, we just found one. We had to look for one. I remember when George W. Bush, you may have remembered him, you know, came to power, he was looking for an enemy quickly, and his eye fell on China originally. But quickly he was told, don't do that, because business is too good with China. Yeah. Find somebody else. And he looked around, and, well, it took a while there. Milosevic was an enemy at that point, you know. But that was good, but there was the new Hitler, right? That was always the good, if you don't like a guy called the new Hitler, that'll do the trick. The suckers will fall for that, right? So the new Hitler. But eventually, Saddam Hussein was the guy that they pointed out. Saddam Hussein was the guy, the new enemy, you know. And he was great as a new enemy, and we bombed the hell out of him, and we could just justify more wars, right? But the great merit of George W. Bush, the genius of it, was to invent a new enemy that we could never defeat, that would guarantee that we'd be at war forever and ever and ever. Because if peace would break out tomorrow, it'd be catastrophe for the American economy. So we need a war, preferably worldwide, forever. Permanent war all over the globe. And that war enemy is terrorism. Terrorism. Even though we have to invent it ourselves. We fabricated it, and that's what the wonderful advantage of the war on terrorism. Terrorism will never hoist the white flag, will never surrender. And we'll forever have to fight it, everywhere, right? But that doesn't mean that we cannot also have other enemies. And then one of the problems, one of the advantages of being an imperialist country is that you want to enjoy being an imperialist. You want to enjoy using the resources of these people in their faraway countries, because that's your industry needs that. And you want to be able to sell your Coca-Cola and your Marlboro cigarettes to these suckers over there too, right? Yep. And you want to sell your Coca-Cola and all that stuff, right? So if some of these guys start to become a little too economically independent, I'm not saying commie or no, just a bit too economically independent minded, you know, like a Saddam Hussein, for example, or a Gaddafi or something like that, you know, that's not allowed. That's a no-no, right? The Soviet Union was wonderful when it's collapsed. And the guy that came on, Boris Yeltsin, a drunk and a criminal and a swine of a man, he was a darling. He was a darling of the West, because he said, "Open the doors, West, come right in. Whatever it wants, take it. It's all yours." With permissions in my pocket, my bank accounts. That's how we created, you know, the oligarchs in Russia and everywhere else, right? Yeah. And Putin was supposed to be a successor. And if Putin would have done the same thing, he would be the darling of the West today. But Putin's great crime, his great sin, is that he didn't do that. Yeah. He actually started to steer a more or less nationalist course. And for that, we can have to be forgiven. Yeah. And that's why we have the war, because obviously that's what led to NATO advancing, and now the situation, the crisis in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, this is great, because we come right up to the present. Why don't I take stack? And I think yesterday one of the things that worked well is we could take kind of 3 or 4 questions from the floor. Constanza, you could kind of take stack, and then afterwards we'll take a few questions from the online program. So who'd like to get us started out? Yeah, David?
I have a question.
And just really quickly, yeah, do use the mic, and as David's talking, just signal me and I can add you to the list. So go ahead, David.
You mentioned the Ukrainians recruited in the prairies, which I think is a fascinating case, because to crush the communists and rising labor movement in the prairies, which is ironically one of the most conservative areas today of Canada. It also made me think of Werner von Braun, the senior engineer who designed rockets for the Nazis, and later recruited to be the senior director of NASA. So I'm wondering, in the post-war era, how would you sort of articulate the role of recruiting former Nazis globally to secure American imperialism and other former allied parties as in a global imperialist expansion of fascism?
And Jacques, I think what we're going to do, if it's okay with you, is we're actually going to take 4 questions first. So Isabella, I think you were up next. Do you want me to note them down? Yeah, no, there's going to be a lot packed in, but that way we get a lot of voices in. Yeah, okay. So recruitment of Nazis, right, and fascists more generally. Does that work?
Okay. Thank you for all your words. Maybe this is a little bit off topic, but I was actually wondering about your notion of counter-history.
About what?
Your notion of counter-history?
I use that word because
I don't know that notion, no.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know what it means.
You don't use that notion?
No, I don't, but okay, I understand what it means.
Okay. So
and I'm all for it.
Well, so let me just reframe my question. So I was just wondering how can we use this notion of counter-history, or reading history against the grain that has been going on for the last years, that comes actually from subaltern studies in a way, but how can we apply this to Latin America specifically? And how can we, for example, what will be the place of literature and the arts, or literary artistic practice within this counter-history that could build like another sense of political action in terms of community?
We're going to bombard you, because there's Nico and then Pedro. Anybody else can just flag me, and we'll do another round in a moment. But Nico?
Yeah, so thank you so much. My question is kind of about like 2 things. I'm thinking about the liberal conception of fascism, and also sort of changes to the global economy since roughly World War II and roughly like the 1970s, right? So I think that the liberal conception of fascism is like very narrow as this like uniquely national thing, right? Like fascism is always sort of framed as a product or a project of like the national bourgeoisie, I think, right? Like I think you sort of paint a picture of capital sort of instrumentalizing like the Third Reich, whereas I think the liberal conception would be this like corporatist idea where the state sort of makes capital subservient to itself for these sort of like idealistic goals, right? And one thing is that sort of globalization and the globalization of the economy has made it sort of harder to label things as purely the project of a given national bourgeoisie, right? Like you mentioned the war on terror, which benefits, like say Halliburton, right? Which I think strikes us all as an American company, but like is largely funded by like European capitalists and certainly like Middle Eastern aristocracies and things of that nature, right? So going back to what Gabriel had said about authoritarianism, I think there's an idea that not only does it place sort of left politics on the same spectrum as like Nazism, so on and so forth, but in the current global economy, it also is used to obscure sort of what fascism or proto-fascism might look like, right? So I think Le Pen, for instance, here is not so offensive because she is a rightist, but because of like this idea that she is an authoritarian, right? And someone like Putin can be called a fascist so easily because he doesn't sort of bend to he doesn't sort of bend the knee to the international capital of the United States, right? Like he's easily labeled as that. So I guess the question is, do you see the sort of inklings of this like collaboration of national sort of capitals in the construction of the Third Reich? And how do you sort of see this sort of globalization and the creation of sort of transnational capital as influencing fascism and what we might consider definitions of fascism?
And we got one more. Pedro?
I'll try to project. So my question is, I think, more about the method of your historical research. You mentioned Marvin Harris in the beginning, and I recently tried to write a paper, try to develop a method of cultural criticism for a course in cultural criticism. And I read a little bit of Marvin Harris's The Riddles of Culture for that. And my difficulty was that although he gives a really good account of how material conditions can constrain, what sort of practices will, or interpretations will be able to exist, right? He talks about the riddle of cows in India and how it actually was very rational to have that seemingly irrational belief. But the difficulty I ran into there is in developing a method of cultural criticism. It doesn't, I guess, give you direction for, it tells you how things happen but not where to go. And so in a sense, that method almost, I think, lacked let's call it a science of values. And so I think, I don't think it's, maybe you disagree, that it's impossible to give an objective reading of history, right? In a sense, you're always going to take a perspective. In this sense, it seems like in this room, we all agree, we all, I think, prefer this, I guess, reject the capitalist perspective, and we're looking at it more like implicit in our reading of history is a condemnation of capitalism and imperialism, but I don't think that's at all obvious in terms of why we should choose that. So I guess my question is, can we incorporate, in a sense, a science of values, or which perspective to take when we look back at history? Because when we're just describing, right, we're not, in a sense, we're not making any normative claims, but clearly in this reading of history there is a kind of underlying normative claim. So I was just wondering if you thought about that.
Well, am I asked the question already, or am I going to wait?
No. Yeah, there are 4 different questions, so you can kind of...
okay, respond to this one first?
Yeah, as you wish.
Last one is first? Well, Marvin Harris is not somebody that is, I consider, a great sort of intellectual source. I came across Marvin Harris and found his readings very interesting and enlightening in some ways. And that's it, essentially. I don't see Marvin Harris promoting a worldview or endorsing a Marxist or non-Marxist, anti-Marxist, a-Marxist view. No, I just found that what he had to say about, for example, why some people in some societies at some time in history, under certain conditions, found it useful, important, almost imperative, not to drink wine, for example, not to use alcohol, especially when it's hot and all that stuff, and there's no land available for crops unless you get rid of crops that are more important. I found that a very, very profound insight, without necessarily meaning that it's the key to a major worldview that would improve what my worldview might be now, but I certainly found it very, very useful. And I found it useful in the context that I mentioned it. It's a materialist approach to explaining things, as opposed to a metaphysical or a religious one. You know what I mean? I mean, most people will tell you, and Marvin Harris is Jewish as far as I know, and he makes a point that most Jews will tell you they don't eat pork because pork is not very healthy. You know, it's a meat that is, you know, that has risks. And if that is so, then how come zillions of Chinese eat pork every day to the point where if you say meat in China, that means pork, you know, unless you specify something else. And he points out that it is, of course, true that you have to know how to prepare pork, you know, and raise pigs properly and eat pork, prepare pork properly to avoid the diseases. That's true for many other types of food as well. You know, some of them you could kill you unless you know how to prepare it. And that's where I thought Marvin Harris's views were extremely interesting, because they fit in that specific aspect of Marxism that says that you have to look at the material things in life, that we don't act in certain ways because of something we believe. No, we believe certain things because of the way we do things. All right. So basically, then, you know, and what you do depends on where you live. Okay. For example, I've had a chance to study the difference between, for example, the Western world in Europe and, say, the Eastern world, let's say China. And much of our history is based on the fact that the reality that we rely on cereals, you know, as our main source of food, and we eat bread. Whereas in China, they rely on rice, for example, right? Well, to grow wheat, to make bread, is a different kind of work from basically growing rice and to eat rice. And that leads to a different lifestyle and a different culture and a different history, you know. And that's the beginning. It's not as if some Chinese person said, "Oh well, I just thought they should eat rice, you know, let's eat rice," and start right there. No, it was the fact that they started, for whatever reason, way back when, cultivating rice, because that was the crop that offered itself. We now know that cereals were the crop that human beings in the beginning of the Neolithic found that was available in the Middle East and also elsewhere, some places, and lend itself to provide food on a regular basis that made it possible to survive. But then wheat, cereals, is a very demanding crop that needs a lot of labor. It's very labor intensive, you know. And that's why, for example, why it fits well with wine, because wine, the vine, does not want fertile land. It'll grow in rocky soil. So viticulture and the raising of cereals complement each other. They don't compete with each other, right? It's the same thing with pigs. Raising pigs was wonderful, but pigs don't need meadows. You know what I mean? That's why people in the old days didn't raise cows to eat meat, because the good land was needed to grow cereals, to eat bread. And so you didn't eat cows. The cows were there, as Marvin Harris says, like in India. You have to pull the plows to perform certain types of labor, even to provide fuel for the little fires and all that stuff, right? But so this is where I found Marvin Harris fantastic insights, great sort of inspiration, and that's it. You know, that's it. I'd recommend reading his book, and that's all I recommend. I'm not saying, oh yeah, you got to become a Marvin Harrisist, you know. But I still do. But because I read that book 30, 40 years ago. And I would still recommend it. I think it's still very, very relevant, you know. And
in the interest of time, though,
Yeah,
because I'm the timekeeper here.
Yes.
So Nico had the question, working backwards, right, about what some people call the transnational capitalist class, and how that relates to national bourgeoisies, right?
Well,
and fascism, authoritarianism.
well, I'm not sure that I understand the question very well, because Nico's obviously a learned man. And sometimes these things, the terminology, I'm not always familiar with. But I believe one of the things you touched upon was how fascism is national, but it's also international, right? And this is why I recommend, for a change, a book of mine, Big Business and Hitler, which actually the title was Big Business with Hitler. Big Business avec Hitler in French. But my publisher in Canada decided to make it and Hitler, and you know why? Because when I called it Big Business with Hitler, it was a play on words. It meant that big business did big business with Hitler.
Yeah.
And Big Business was with Hitler.
It's a better title.
Was supporting him. Yeah. But I
Catchy.
think the publisher found that a bit probably too,
Yeah.
I'm already amazed that my publisher in Toronto, who's actually a very modern liberal, publishes my books, because my friends say, what? You get published? I don't know, he must, my last book, I thought for sure he's not going to take it. For sure. It took him a year, but he eventually took it. And he never asked me to change anything, which is another amazing thing. I must say, he's pretty tolerant. So yeah, so that's what, so in that book, I deal with the fact that the rise of Hitler was made possible. Hitler was the creation of German capital and international capital, all right? I mean, in my book on Big Business and Hitler, I have 2 parts and a little intermission. Part 1 is German capitalism in Hitler. Part 2 is American capitalism in Hitler. And part 3 is the other capitalisms and fascism. Meaning that every capitalism in every country, capitalist country, considered supporting, did support, considered bringing to power, did sometimes bring to power fascist movements, okay? For sure. Right? And not only in their own land, but looked across the borders. We know for a fact that Hitler from the start was supported big time by Swiss bankers and by American bankers. And Ford apparently, it's not so clear. I mean, I wouldn't swear to it, but
Suzanne Poole has demonstrated. Suzanne Poole has demonstrated.
Yes, I believe so. That there's support,
Ford
financial support came from the United States already to Germany, to Hitler in the 1920s, long before Hitler got to power. And not just out of the goodness of their heart, there was something in it. In fact, one of the people that works between Germany to be Nazi Germany and the United States was Jacques, Hitler's banker. Because Jacques was the man, the German banker with American connections. He had relatives, I believe, he had been in the States, he spoke English, he was highly regarded over there, and he was German. So he knew how to get American bankers interested in loaning money to Hitler when he needed it.
Yeah. I think another part of the question was how fascism relates to authoritarianism. If I'm not simplifying too much, that's what I'm.
Just sort of pointing to the example of how, I think the use of the term authoritarianism allows, like, the selective, allows liberals to pick and choose what does and doesn't count as fascism, insofar as it, does or doesn't sort of benefit global economies or benefit the market in some sense.
But in my book on Myths of Modern History, it deals with the story, the history of democracy, and how the upper classes hate democracy, all right? They hate it, and you can understand why. They're a minority. And democracy means democracy. The demos in democracy is the people, but not the people, it's the common people, the ordinary people, okay? It's not, the demos does not include the bankers and the aristocrats, okay? So democracy is where the common people come to power. So how could the elite be in favor of democracy? I mean, the idea that Queen Elizabeth loves democracy is bullshit. Absolute bullshit, right? The idea that bankers love democracy is bullshit. I mean, no way, Jose. And I can understand them. They'd be stupid too. Of course, they'd be stupid too, right? I mean, so, the history of democracy. The beginning is the history of the upper class against democracy and the lower class for democracy. And the upper class tried to prevent democracy from it. Right? And in fact, it's also the history of the upper class because of revolutions that promote democracy having to make concessions to democracy. Reluctantly, very slowly, very reluctantly, to be any concession to be clawed back as soon as possible. As soon as possible. For example, after the First World War, because of the Russian Revolution, in many countries, in France, in Belgium, in Britain, even Holland and Switzerland, neutral countries, after the war, after the Russian Revolution, everybody knew that capitalism had caused that war, and everybody admired, most people admired the Soviet Union, the Ruskies, for making a revolution against it, and wanted to follow the example. And the fear of revolution was all over. You never read that in history books, they don't want you to know that, right? And what was this, could you do to stop it? Well, basically, repression, and also concessions, okay? The carrot and the stick. The stick and the carrot. The carrot was the quick introduction of reforms to throw oil on the waves of potential revolution. That's what happened, for example, in Belgium. Quick, the 8-hour day. Quick, universal suffrage. Before the war, the elites would never have done that. But after the war, the elites introduced it. It doesn't come from the bottom up. I mean, a lot of people imagine after the war that the governments, to reward people for their loyal service during the war, introduced universal suffrage and 8-hour day. Bullshit. bullshit. Just the fear of revolution that did it. And the reason why, the awful proof that it's not to reward anybody was that they only rewarded those that were dangerous enough to be feared for revolutionary intentions. Because, for example, in France and in Britain, during the war, who had made the sacrifices that deserved to be rewarded? Well, the common soldiers. But how about those tirailleurs sénégalais, all those black Africans who had died by the tens of thousands for France, from Morocco, from Algeria, who had died for the fatherland that exploited and abused them? Did they get anything after the war? Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. Millions of Indians fought for Britain in the First World War. Did they get even a little bit of autonomy after? Nothing. Nothing at all. Why? There seemed to be no fear of revolution, so nothing for you. But when in Belgium, in Britain, there was actually strikes, there was actually mutinies in the armies. You'd never hear about them read in my book about it, but you would not hear about that in books. They don't want you to know about that, right? When that happened, concessions. Yeah. Let me tell you the example in Belgium. In Belgium,
because I'm going to be the timekeeper. It's a horrible role, but there's a lot of great questions. So let's. There was a question about how subaltern history or counter history relates to Latin America, right? And
how about culture and art
and culture and art as well. Yeah.
Well, I really haven't given any specific thought about that. But I mean, obviously, Latin America is a much abused continent ever since the Spaniards arrived, essentially, and the Spaniards were the first ones to abuse of Latin America. Well, the Portuguese, of course, I include them as well. So I guess we say Latin America, not Spanish America. And then later on, the British came in, as you know, and played a very important role in Latin America. And then it was squeezed out by the Americans after the Monroe Doctrine and so on, right? And one of the things, well, it's the same with imperialism in general, I think. I see Latin America being more or less to the United States what India has been or was in the past, to Britain, what Indochina was to France, what the Congo was to Belgium, what Indonesia was to the Netherlands. Basically, huge foreign lands, that to be exploited at will, and where you could grab whatever you wanted. And here I want to mention something that I find is of great interest. You may be old enough to remember John Paul II, right? And his crusade for democracy, right? Yeah, right. Yeah, democracy in Poland, right? In Eastern Europe. Yeah. But people in Latin America who were for the liberation theology, priests and nuns who were for real democracy, got the cold shoulder from John Paul II. He didn't want nothing to do with it. And the fact that the death squads got rid of Romero and of a bunch of nuns and all that stuff, no problem. Right? But I know why. I traveled in Eastern Europe quite a bit, and I've asked the local guide once, did the church, the Catholic Church, recover all the land it lost when the communists took over in 1945? Oh my God, how'd you know that? I said, yeah, how? Because you'd never read about that. The crusade of John Paul II was about getting the land back for the church. Okay? And the crusade, the lack of a crusade for democracy in Latin America was for the church not to lose the land. All right? Let me just clarify something here. In France, in the French Revolution, the French revolutionaries, they weren't even commies, confiscated the land of the church, parceled it out, and sold it off. And today, much of the lands of vineyards that belong to the Cluny Monastery in Burgundy are owned by thousands of little vineyards, right? And not so little. And when later on the Pope wanted to get the land back, he said, sorry, you can't, it's been sold, it's privatized. When the Soviets introduced a revolutionary change in Eastern Europe, in Catholic Poland, Catholic Czechia, Catholic Slovakia, Catholic Hungary, Catholic Croatia, Catholic whatever, right? The land was mostly owned by the church and the aristocracy. Right. And it was socialized, not privatized, which left open the possibility of it being recuperated. And the whole purpose of John Paul II's actions in Poland was for democracy, meaning the church to get land back, and the aristocracy. Today, the big landowners of the big lords, aristocracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire are back in possession. Not all of them of all possessions, that's true. But most everywhere they own everything back. Yeah.
That's
So in Latin America, there was no need for such a thing, because in Latin America, the church was a beneficiary, was one of the great landowners, and had the land. And there, the democracy would mean that they would have to cough up the land and give it to the farmers who were the land, but no way, Jose. Literally, Jose, right? No way. I told that story once to a person who was very Catholic. He said, that's not true. That's not true. I said, well, look, hey, you know, I'm just telling you, that's what.
Yeah.
He came back to me later on, he said, he asked the parish priest, his parish priest, very Catholic man, Quebecois. He said, I asked my parish priest. He said, if that's true, that John Paul II did not want democracy in Latin America because the church owns the land, therefore had no interest in bringing democracy, which risked losing the land. And the priest had said, yeah, it's true, but you know, the poor people over there wouldn't know what to do with the land anyways. What a disgusting argument, right? What a totally disgusting argument. And he said to me, yeah, you're right. Not that I want to be right, but I mean, that's just what it is.
What happened, yeah. So David had the question on the recruitment of fascists, and then Constanza, I'm going to bring you in. If you could just, I think we're going to have the online people actually just announce their questions themselves, but you can walk us through the stack of 3 to 4 questions in a second.
So what was the question?
The recruitment of fascists in the post-war era, right? Particularly by US, Canada, or other imperial forces.
Well,
Yeah.
the Western countries, Britain, United States, Canada, never had anything against fascism. In fact, they liked fascism a lot. But in some cases, they didn't need fascism. However, in some countries, they considered bringing in fascists. You wrote an article about that not so long ago, the business plot, right? So it was certainly considered by some. In France, there was an attempt to bring in fascism. Didn't work. So they arranged a defeat against Germany in 1940, as Andy Lacroix has shown, to bring in fascism to the back door, so to speak, via a defeat against Germany. They hated Hitler, but they loved a fascist dictator, and that became Pétain, right? So in the Western world, they like fascism. The royal family are fascists. I mean, today, they're all Democrats. I told you, they have no reason to be Democrats, and they are not Democrats. You know, it's just a fantasy. So the fascists were always on our side, except when they happened to be enemies. Why were they enemies? Why did Britain, for example, and the United States fight Nazi Germany? They never wanted to fight them. They wanted Nazi Germany to fight the Soviets and watch from the sidelines. But history has strange ways of doing things, and history is full of ironies. And I could tell the story of the 1930s and the appeasement policy of London and Paris and Washington, whereby they thought for sure they'd be off the hook, and that the Germans, the idea was to get that that wonderful guy, Hitler, march to Moscow and do what we never could do in 1919, basically destroy the Soviet Union, right? That was the end of that.
I think the question was as well, though, about the post-war era, right?
And so what happens is that these fascists were seen to be wonderful, except that we stumbled into war against them, right? And I won't get, the war was unwanted. The war against, like these generals said, we're fighting the wrong war. We're fighting with the good guys, against the good guys, with the bad guys. So when the war is over, the idea was right away to go back to the normal situation. And I told you already what they did with the fascists. They kept as many as possible in their uniforms, with their weapons under their command. They even allowed the Canadian Army in occupied Holland, even allowed German troops, still under their own officer, to execute some of the deserters. Did you know that? You're from Canada, right? You're from Canada? Well, I'm from Canada too, but you never hear about that, do you? But they actually allowed it, even though the Canadian Army had bombarded German positions with basically pamphlets saying, why die for Hitler in the last weeks of the war? Come to us, surrender, you know, and the war is over for you. And the Germans grabbed some of these guys, and the Canadian authorities authorized these guys to execute their deserters in The Hague. Can you believe it? Now, so the war is over, but these guys are there. And many of them had fled. Many of these awful collaborators who had committed awful crimes in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you know, in all these countries where collaboration with the Nazis was an awful thing, and they committed the worst crimes. Sometimes the Germans themselves were disgusted with the way that they massacred people. You may have seen pictures of that, of the massacres in Kaunas, of people that were clubbed to death with steel bars and all that stuff, you know. It's awful, actually, right? And these guys fled, you know, when the Red Army was on the move, of course, right? They weren't going to fight, well, some did stay behind and fight. And where were they to go? They were DPs, deported persons. They were given a passport. The rat lines, it's called. Where even the biggest war criminals were given a passport.
America.
And smuggled from Bavaria, from Franciscan monastery to Genoa, where they were on an Italian ship and they crossed. and they went to the United States and Canada. And the worst cases were in South America, okay? The Argentinians, the Chileans, they could have them. Some of them have still colonies over there, right? I mean, you could go to Chile and there's still a happy Bavaria over there, you know, they're still there. You know, I've been through, I know these things, I've been there quite a few times. Not these colonies, but I know what happened. And to Canada. Canada welcomed tens of thousands of them. And I personally, in my hometown, the town where I live in Canada, was invited a few times to celebrate New Year's Eve in the Ukrainian church. And there in that hall Ukrainian church was pictures of Bandera and the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. It was all there, right there, right? In your face. And they built in Oakville, there's a monument to the SS. And in Edmonton too, you know that, don't you? Well, there you go. So these guys were useful. And I remember also visiting the Yugoslav embassy in the 70s, and there was guards there because the Croatian fascists that had fled Tito's Yugoslavia after the war, they were hanging around Toronto and threatening to kill whatever Yugoslav officials were there in the consulate, right? And it was the same thing with the Romanian fascists and Hungarian fascists and Polish fascists, you know, they were welcome, because they could be relied on in the Cold War for anti-communist service. So that's why they were recruited. The CIA must have recruited hundreds of thousands of them. And like I say, some of them were given jobs at universities to teach Soviet studies because they were the experts, right? And they were freedom fighters, of course, right? If you asked them, did you guys, what did you do? We freedom fighters. We fought the Soviets, yeah, but we fought the Russians, the Germans too, you know? They didn't, but that was all gobbled up. Believe that stories, right? So that's why it makes sense. If you're anti-Soviet, anti-communist, anti-Russian, it makes sense to not to use Nazis because they're the fiercest anti-Soviet, anti-communist. How would you not use them? I mean, they're your friends, they're your buddies, they're ideal collaborators. You know, that's why they're there. But we don't see them. Our newspapers don't see them. Our media don't see them. That's propaganda.
Yeah, and it's the same in the U.S. Tens of thousands is Eric Lichtau's put that number forward. There's lots of great literature on this if people are interested, because it's incredibly important history to know. Fascism isn't somehow just an exception to the capitalist system. It's baked in, it's part of it, and it's part of the ongoing class warfare.
And it's increasingly becoming the rule.
And it is, exactly. If you want to understand the war in Ukraine, you have to understand this history, because the organization of Ukrainian nationalists were the fascists and ultranationalists who collaborated with the Nazis against the Soviet Union, and that history is in continuity with the Nazi brigades that are currently supported by the US and imperialist interests in Ukraine. We could say a lot more about that, but we're going to have Constanze, I'll turn it over to you for you select the 3 or 4 questions, and we're going to try to keep it as tight as possible. So go ahead.
So there are many questions in the room. I would like to ask my own. It's a rather methodological question on the relationship between imperialism, capitalism, and democracy. I will mention an example that kind of follows up on what's being commented before. Everybody knows that in the 60s and the 70s there was a really active speech on the dangers against democracy. In Latin America, this allowed for a huge number of undemocratic military coups in the region. And in Argentina, for example, in particular, it permitted a really systematic effort to persecute communists, anarchists, socialists, and a lot of LGBT militants. And this was known as the Plan Condor. Plan Condor, it had very specific economic goals, and by that I mean that it was not a mere ideological, ethical effort in the region. So my question / comment is just to follow up on what was being said before is in which ways can a conceptualization of imperialism help us understand the relationship between democracy and capitalism? Other than that, there's Emiliano, Luis, Miranda, and Jim, and also Leah. If you'd like to jump in.
Sorry.
Yes, hi. I'm actually in Chile, so I'm very close to Colonia Dignidad, which is the place where Paul Schaeffer, one of the Nazi officers, found refuge through the rat lines and through the collaboration of the Dulles brothers in the whole post-World War II era project of rehabilitation of Nazi spy networks. So my question, I'm going to try to keep it simple, but you know, I'm in Chile now. I lived 20 years in Minneapolis, where you arrive there, you arrive at the Lindbergh airport, which is also a Nazi sympathizer. And so I'm interested in the question of the reconstitution of the world capitalist class after World War II. Especially because in some ways I think NATO and what's happening today in Ukraine, the expansion of NATO in the post-war era period, in some ways kind of fulfills Hitler's dream of go east, young men, or the Lebensraum, the living space. In the lectures that I heard with you and Gabriel, you emphasized how, and I think this is the distinction that I find the most interesting, which is how Hitler was, and Hitler and Mussolini and Franco were instruments of the capitalist class. I've been working on a play about J.D. Rockefeller, and I was very surprised to discover how much Standard Oil, J.D. Rockefeller, and the U.S. capitalist class contributed to the rise of the Third Reich in very material, concrete ways. Like, for example, you were talking about fuel. I discovered that the jet fuel of the Luftwaffe was the product of secret dealings brokered by the Dulles brothers to keep the Nazi war machine operating. And what is most surprising, I think, for most Americans who have like a Hollywood brainwash propaganda view of the world, is to discover that without that support, without the support of the US capitalist class, the Hitler war machine would not have been possible, right? So in that sense, I guess the question is this. So the Hitler project to destroy the Soviet Union, to kill communism in its cradle, to kill the dragon in the lair, did not work, did not succeed. Do you see in some ways NATO and the expansion of NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union as a continuation of that project of the world capitalist class to fulfill the dream of the world capitalist class of, I guess, global hegemony? And I'll leave it there because I think that should be enough.
So which question do you answer?
I think there's going to be another one or two.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. My question was about, I'm curious about what you think, to what extent anti-Semitism was instrumentalized by the Nazis for the purpose of encouraging working class support, scapegoating to sort of deflect attention from the actual sources of economic exploitation, and to what extent German industrialists, American industrialists, bankers, capitalists, other financiers were actually motivated by anti-Semitism, maybe present in the superstructure.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here real quick as well? My question is similar to one that's already been asked, so it's tied in. About what we mean by democracy and what the role of authority in democracy is. It seems like throughout this discussion we've had a few different concepts of democracy operating, some that focus more on forms of formal politics or of emancipation, but also these have all been connected to concrete privileges and the real content as well. And at the same time, democracy doesn't seem to just be an unequivocal good either. It's something that bourgeoisie is also mobilizing to try to cultivate a false consciousness among the working class. And then, on the other hand, we have the dictatorship of the proletariat as also being a kind of victory for democracy, even though it is authoritatively imposing the will of the working class upon bourgeoisie and petite bourgeoisie. So what does this then mean for the role that authority plays in democracy, and how does this transform what we mean by democracy through this conversation?
As long as we're at it, because we're almost at the end of our time, I see, Jim, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'll just have, I wanted to ask some specific thing, but can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'll just ask something general. First of all, I just feel like there's a lot of stuff we can talk about over a few beers. It's probably not good in this context, but I just really wanted to ask, I see a lot of similarity between the way you look at history and, and this theorist I really like, James Vernon, and he's really good at, peeling back the so-called formalist presentation of the state's ideology versus the really underlying realist forces that's in operation, namely most of the time probably an oligarchy that already exists in history. So I don't know if you have anything to say about this guy, but besides that, I just want to ask you, when you drop names like Chrystia Freeland and Victoria Nuland and maybe like Robert Kagan, like how do you operate in today's intellectual and academic environment? Like, are you not afraid of, getting the same treatment as, say, someone like David Irving, who does similar type of so-called revisionist history? Like, I'm extremely fascinated that, Gabriel was able to invite you into this lecture. And thank you for really everything that you said. Like, I think a lot of the critical thinking you provided is really needed in today's dialogue.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yes. There's quite a few questions, but
I
you have
know,
to repeat to me what they were. The first question was about Argentina, I
And
believe.
Plan Condor. Yeah.
And what?
Plan Condor.
And how imperialism,
Yeah,
capitalism,
I'm
democracy relate.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know exactly what the question was, but I'm aware of the Condor organization in Argentina. But again, I see it as basically the imperialist beast, so to speak, stretching its tentacles to make sure that countries that are supposed to be vassals of the system remain vassals. And this is very important, I believe, and it's relevant in terms of the other questions being asked already too, that to be in the bad books of imperialism, and this really means today the supremo of imperialism, which is American imperialism, and its ally, which is the subordinate imperialisms, the privileged elites within the subordinate imperialisms, like the French, the Dutch, the German ones. They are subordinate and they work together, right? So that's why the European Union essentially never opposes anything the United States wants. Right? The United States basically wants the war in Russia, okay? And the European Union says, amen, so be it. That there's nobody, even though it's not in the interest of the Germans, for example, to be cut off from Russian gas, but I guess Washington wants it, therefore the Germans have no choice but to go ahead, right? Even though I would say probably if there would be a referendum, 90% of the Germans would have been against it, and they'd be freezing in the cold probably next fall. So American and international imperialism does not support any kind of nationalism. Certainly no nationalist economic policies that may be in the interests of the people, which would make them democratic projects. They want projects that are in the interests of their multinationals and banks so they can make the money. Okay, I'll take Venezuela. Obviously the system in Venezuela now is hated, detested by Washington, by the empire, by imperialism, because it doesn't cater to the needs. It doesn't open the doors and say, come right in, Mr. American bankers and oil firms, and help yourself. Right? This is what Yeltsin did in Russia, and that's what Putin refused to do, and that's why Putin is in the Black Book. Similarly, that's why Saddam Hussein, that's why Gaddafi were in the Black Book and got murdered, got killed, got wiped out. So Condor was basically one way to enforce. Similarly, in Europe, you have the NATO Gladio organization. I mean, there is not only the CIA, there is the NATO and the different armies and police forces in imperialist countries are part of this network of, we could say, repression. It is. I mean, I don't know if you know Daniele Ganser's work on Gladio, on NATO stay-behind forces and the awful crimes they have committed. You know about that? Does anybody know about that? Yeah. I mean, and again, in Italy and in Belgium especially, where they murdered people, basically to terrorize people. And that's a real terror, actually, genuine terror. And from what I understand, Condor was a similar project involving Latin America, especially Argentina, I believe. But not only Argentina. Yes. So
one of the second questions was about the NATO. Is NATO doing the job that the Nazis didn't get done, and expanding Western imperialism to the east?
Yes.
Well, that was good. Emiliano, I hope you were happy with that quick answer. Then the third question. Okay, I see we're all ready to pick up some speed.
Yeah.
The third question was about anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Was it real or fabricated in the case of the Nazi?
Anti-Semitism is the key to understanding Nazism, Hitler, and the Holocaust. Without understanding that, you can begin to understand the Holocaust. And to understand Hitler's anti-Semitism, which was not only Hitler's, was the anti-Semitism of Germans, Frenchmen, all over Europe, starting in the late 19th century. Anti-Semitism is an anti-Semitism of a modern variety, different from the traditional anti-Semitism. Okay, anti-Semitism has been around ever since the advent of Christianity. But Christianity was against Jews who didn't believe that Christ was the Messiah, And therefore, they were against them as they were against any paganism has been wiped out, as you may know. Talk about totalitarianism, and I will talk about that. I think Christianity, when it comes to power in the Roman Empire, that was totalitarianism. And the proof is in the pudding. There's nothing left of paganism. Nothing. Gone. Wiped off the face of the earth. Right? That was totalitarianism. So the purpose of traditional Christian, ancient, medieval, even all to the French Revolution, anti-Semitism was to convert Jews. Okay? If a Jew was willing to convert to Christianity, he was a good guy or a good woman. Right? Hitler, no. Hitler's anti-Semitism of the 19th century. And anti-Semitism, that new anti-Semitism, must be seen as an anti-Marxist, anti-socialist, and later on anti-communist, anti-Soviet too. Because anti-Semitism says that the big problems of society have nothing to do with class, but with race. All right? Simple as that. Marx is wrong when he says it's the upper class exploiting. No, it's not class, it's race against race. You, all of us, rich and poor, are lucky to be part of the superior race. And you should congratulate yourself. And even the lowest of us is much better than the highest of the class below us. So the conflicts in the world are due to the fact that there's a hierarchy of races. With us, understandably, the smart, the beautiful, the hardworking people on top, and then below us, the lazy, the criminals, the stupid, blah, 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 all of them not like us, blonde, blue-eyed, and tall like me, but sort of dark-skinned, yellow-skinned, the inferior races. That's the problem. Now, the problem that the Chinese, the blacks, they're inferior, and that's not a big problem because they're in their faraway countries, and we have men that can handle them. The problem is that there's a race that hates us because they're jealous. They want to overthrow the natural, society where we are on top, right? Because they hate us, they want to take over, right? And they are not black or yellow, and they're not far away. They're amongst us. And we can't tell who they are, but we know who they are. They're the Jews. And you know what? They're out to get us. And the only way we can avoid that they get us is to get them. Because they want to basically wipe us out. So we must wipe them out. So no converting. Don't come up and saying, I know a nice Jew. Fuck that. We got to kill them all. At first, get rid of them. Ship them off to Madagascar or somewhere. That was the plan. That was actually the Polish regime's plan, and Hitler liked it. Right? But if you can't get rid of them, I'm sorry, they have to kill them. Because if not, they're going to kill us. That was what the SS said to their men who sent children to the gas chambers. Maybe a tough job, but you have to do it. Because if you don't do it, those children will grow up and kill your children. So you got to be tough. It's an honor. I should consider it an honor that you have the guts to do that. To kill women, children, yes, it's tough, but it's a dirty job. Someone's going to do it. So that anti-Semitism is the key to understanding Hitler's idea. And actually the idea not only of Hitler, but the idea was then also that the way in which Hitler and any anti-Semites of that old style, of which Hitler was only one of them, Gobineau was a French example of that early 19th century. The only way to I have to think now for a minute. The only way to get rid of them then is, like I say, you have to get rid of them. But oh shit, I forgot what I was going to say about that. I got a little too.
I mean,
sorry, I get a little.
It's okay. We've been going 2 hours nonstop, so I know we're almost at the end of our time.
Yeah.
And I was curious personally how that related to the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that's right.
A big role.
Yes.
But actually, just in the interest of time, I know that if people need to leave either the call or the room, there's also a back door, so you can kind of tiptoe out. Again, we will quietly judge you, but maybe if you do it quickly, we won't see you. But I know there's at least 2 more questions. One by...
Can I just finish that one?
Yeah.
So it was the idea that anti-Semitism basically, the way in which Jews try to destroy our society is through socialism. Socialism basically is the invention of the Jews, right? And Marx was a socialist, Lenin was a socialist, he was a Jew, he was not, it doesn't matter, they pretend he was, Trotsky was a Jew, he was, So that's the idea then that the Jews invented socialism and later on communism as a way to subvert our system. And Hitler, famously, and Mussolini and all these guys agreed that Soviet Union was Russia ruled by the Jews.
Yeah.
It was Russland unter Judenherrschaft. That was it. That's why we have to wipe them out too. You know. And that's why they thought it was easy, because they thought it was created by inferior people. Therefore, we're going to just like business kick in the door and the whole house will come crumbling down. That was the big optimistic expectation in June 41. You know.
Yeah. And I know that from there were some questions around democracy and authority. I'm going to see if I can sum them up in a moment, but let's just turn quickly to, it was Marissa, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm going to be quick also. Part of my question has been addressed for a previous question. But I was just wondering, so we were talking about like, you know, crumbs of wealth given to working classes, or some very small concessions by the ruling class because there was a threat to revolution. So like democracy, like liberal democracy always had a facade of like some dialogue between the ruling class and the ruled. And I think like specifically in the United States right now, it's kind of broken because there are a lot of like the abortion ban is very unpopular. Medicare for all, very popular, probably never gonna happen. A bunch of stuff like that, they're like, in opinion polls, very popular amongst the public, but politicians never do anything about it. So there's like, even the facade of like this dialogue between politicians and the public, I think is now crumbling. And I'm just wondering, how can we combat that, or how can we bring back, like, what do you think we can do about like bringing back the threat of revolution or something, just so we can get Biden to do something, you know?
Well,
Is it okay if we take the two more? I know it's a little cumbersome, but that way we get as many voices in as we can. Cecilia?
Hi, thank you first. I am very interested in how the notion of modern myths, or as you call myths of modern history, relate to the conversation that we have been having today, especially in the construction of imperialist imaginaries and narratives that kind of justify colonialism projects and totalitarianism projects. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how, like, the role of these myths and modern myths, and how are they different from like classical myths, for example, and also how they relate to the notion of counter history or undoing history that has been mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Juan.
Yeah, sorry, it was just a question that is related to the question that was made before by Miranda, I think.
Yeah.
And it was about like how, well, she was talking about how anti-Semitism was more or less instrumentalized by the right to like seduce in a way some sections of the working class too, because they needed to have some favor of the working class at the time. And I want to think about that, but in today's standards, because we're seeing a lot of like resurgence of like right wing in countries like, I don't know, we can say the United States, like Trump, for example. How this, for example, how they're instrumentalizing anything, for example, imagining the foreign or the immigrant as the new like Semite or anti-Semite or Jew or whatever. So this is the real enemy, and they're seducing more the working class than the left is doing actually. Like the right wing is being more successful to do that. So that would be my question. Okay.
Okay, which was the first question which I'm supposed to answer?
Yeah. I think we should get you some wine now, right?
Yeah, right.
you are what you eat.
Yeah, exactly.
You need
you are what
something
you drink. You are what you drink.
Yeah.
The ambitious something with democracy.
Yes, yeah, because the question about democracy and authority I think was quite interesting, and I'm sorry that, and there were 2 or 3 of them actually, so sure.
In my introduction, I talk quite a bit about democracy, because this book is about the history of democracy. And the democracy, as it develops, progresses, regresses, stalls, between war and revolution. Revolution has a way of promoting, fast-forwarding democracy, and war has a way of pulling it back. The French Revolution made a tremendous advance for democracy. First World War was an attempt to basically undo the French Revolution and undo democracy. The elites, democracy, you have to also understand, the way that we use the word in our society is we really mean, when we say democracy, we mean liberal democracy. We mean procedural democracy. We mean elections. For being able to vote, imagine that, a wonderful privilege. Every 4 years for an American to vote, we mean one asshole or another one. I would never, I don't live in the United States, I would never vote for anybody. And so far, I wouldn't have voted for Obama, because I knew that it was a fake. None of these guys would ever, I would never drive a mile to vote. It's not worth it. And I understand why a huge percentage of Americans don't bother to vote for president, because it's useless anyways, right? So what kind of democracy is that? Well, so you can vote. Well, big deal. And why is two parties wonderful, but one party's bad? You know, communism was like, oh, bad, one party, ooh, but two parties, fine. You know? I mean, who said that, right? But democracy is not only procedural, it's not only about elections and all that, it's also social, okay? Democracy is when the state allows input from the demos, that is to say the common people, not just the Kennedys, the Bushes, the top dogs that always come back again and again, right? But from local people, from ordinary people, right? And where not only the state allows input from these people, but does something for them. Imagine that. Imagine that, doing something for them, like social services, like providing basic infrastructure that people need, like, for example, public transportation. You know, I live in Canada, like some of you. I find it disgusting that I have to pay to get to Toronto, which is 1 hour by train, something like $100 back and forth. In France, it's probably $10. You know? And France is not exactly a wonderful place, but it's certainly a hell of a lot more. The services for ordinary people. I bought 10 tickets in the subway, it was €7, I think. At home, at Toronto, you probably get 1 ticket or 2 tickets for that. You know? It's way too expensive. And then the high cost and lousy service of public transportation forces people to drive their cars, which causes pollution, all that stuff. I'm just saying, in the democracy, the state does something for people. It provides maybe minimum wages, does something for women, so they can, you know, it does something for old people, you know, like me. You know what I mean? It provides social services, right? And that's what should be done. And I can tell you something. If democracy is indeed not only political, but input from below, but does something for people like that, then we must all recognize that we don't have democracy. All right? I'm sorry, there is no democracy. There's no such thing as American democracy. There's no such thing as Canadian democracy. We don't have democracy. You know what we have? Fake democracy. Faux democracy. In my book, I invented a word for it in English. It's called pseudo-democracy, and I call it pseudomocracy. That's what we have. Pseudomocracy. It's a system that, it looks a bit like democracy. It has some bells and whistles that conjure up democracy. You can't vote. Yeah, you can't vote for, you know, the Liberal Party or the ex-Liberal Party or the pro-Liberal Party or whatever. You know, you can actually give your vote to somebody, right? You can vote. You're allowed to, right? But it's all like it's just bells and whistles. It's just like, you know, style. You got a lot of style, but very little substance. I mean, there was a study done in the United States recently by some professor at, was it Princeton or something? Yeah. Where I forgot the title of the name, and they came to the conclusion that, sorry, the United States is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy, a plutocracy, you know, run by rich people. And that's true for France. I mean, Macron used to be banker for Rothschilds, right? Well, I just was in the part of France where Pompidou was born. And it said he was also a banker for Rothschilds way back when. I mean, how come these bankers become presidents? Why doesn't a miner from Arras or become president, right? I mean, it's a democracy with ordinary people. Why do bankers, why do the rich people like Kennedy and Trump become president? Because only rich people become president. You know, so it's not a democracy. It's not a democracy. Too bad.
Well, actually, the next question, Marissa's, I think, segues with this, and that is that particularly today, there are so few concessions being made by the ruling class within the capitalist core. What can we do to make them make more concessions?
Well, I don't have an easy solution for that. I sympathize with the yellow vests. You know, I regret that COVID came in, and maybe it was brought in to basically eliminate some of these movements that became pretty threatening. You guys remember the yellow vests, don't you? Somebody, you know, the Gilets jaunes. And there was demonstrations like that, you know, can have an effect. Now, mind you, not all of us have an opportunity or inclination to participate. But yeah, you do what you can. Via the internet, you can also make your voice heard. You know, you can join certain groups that do good work. You know, that basically are active. I don't think it's going to lead to a collapse of the system in a short notice or in a short period of time. But yeah, we can do little things like that. We can join organizations, including parties, that you like and that stand for radical change. And there's going to have to be radical change. I mean, I was not born a revolutionary. I was born like I say, from a very conservative family, in a way, in a way, most of us just want to lead a quiet, pleasant life, drink some wine, eat some good food, and, go on a holiday to France once in a while. But I mean, this cannot go on. What we have going on now, this cannot go on. And if we do nothing, we're going to go down the tube, for sure. And how that's going to be, it could be awful, it could be just simply like a slow, long decline, or it could be a total, utter, catastrophic collapse, I don't know. But this cannot go on. So we have to, that's a message you're going to have to get across, whichever way you can. And I guess being here is one way that you help to bring it about.
And then there was, Cecilia's question was on how myths justify imperialism and how these myths relate potentially to earlier myths or also to counter myths, or not necessarily counter myths, but other narratives, right?
Okay, I write in my book, in the introduction, quite a bit about myths. And you asked the difference with Greek myths, the mythology of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Ancient myths are not lies, they're not poor inventions. They are a nice story that is woven around historical facts. Okay? And the Greek myth typically has a lot of fantasy, but there's some historical tidbits, nuggets of historical reality that are in there. The voyages of Ulysses, Odysseus, basically are an echo of the first voyages of the ancient Greeks, that explored the Mediterranean and established colonies in Sicily and so forth, right? So that is, and the function of a myth of the ancient Greeks is to socialize people, to persuade them, to bring them to accept the system in which they live, to be proud of being a member of that people, of that society, right? Okay? So, today, we don't have myths like that, but we have history. And today, much of our history contains myths. Okay? Ancient myths contain history. Today, our history contains myths. Right? And this history, too, with its myths, is there not to convey us the reality, no, to socialize you, to make you accept society, to be proud to be an American, a Canadian, a Frenchman, whatever, to think that your country is the best in the world, right? Just because you're part of it, and it gives you the facts. And that's why history is very dangerous. Napoleon actually thought history was subversive, because real history may not make you all that proud that your country actually, had slavery for many, many years, became rich on the expropriation, the massacre, the genocide of native people. They don't want you to know that, right? Essentially, that's why the writing of history today is highly controlled. That's why a book like mine, an author like me, you'll never see me on TV. I think I would look good on TV, but no, they don't want me on TV. Why is that?
Well, we're filming you here, so I'm gonna call up CNN and
there's too much reality in there, and not enough myth. You know what I mean? And the kind of history they want is a history that explains things and makes you feel really good. It's feel-good history that is one. And for example, when I say that much of the wealth of the first world was created on the backs of the people in the third world, in the global south, that the riches were accumulated in the global north at the expense of the global south, which all of you know, I assume, they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that. That is not, and that's why the people in the global north, who are the very wealthy, they want to control the writing of history. And they want to make sure that the myths go in there, that explain it differently, And those books will be promoted. Those books will be available. Those authors will be interviewed, on TV. But because they have myth, and the myth is to socialize. It's to make you feel good. It's the historians will explain that. Well, yeah, to be the British. Sure, they were some tough. They did some nasty things in India. But overall, it was pretty good because they built railways. You know what I mean? And let's face it, those Indians, as Churchill said, were beastly people with a beastly religion. Blah blah blah. So we civilized them a bit, and it's good for them. It was good for them. And yeah, sure, we organized a famine in Bengal, but that was during the war. Blah blah blah. So you rationalize, you justify, and that's what they want. That's the myth. That creates the myth that colonialism wasn't all that bad. That even the colonized people benefited from it. Yeah, they should be grateful, really. Should be grateful. There's a lot of historians today that write like that. A lot of politicians in France and elsewhere that say, yeah, France has been good to Algeria, yeah. And Britain was good, and Belgium was good to Congo. But people believe in Belgium. You know, and people want, well, no, that's the kind of stuff they want you to believe. So that's where the myths come in, you know. And that's where the reality is different. And believing a myth is like believing in Santa Claus. You know? I mean, as a kid, I believed in Santa Claus. And I didn't want to give up believing in Santa Claus, but I was afraid he might stop giving me gifts if I stopped believing in him. And a lot of people want to believe the myths. They want to believe it. They feel good. They want to feel good history. You know? But as opposed to that, I would say that if you discover the reality behind the myths, if you can see how we can look behind the myth and look at the reality, that's a very liberating thing. You know? I must say, I didn't find it easy to read books like those by Michael Parenti and Gabriel Kolko that gave me a totally different view of American history than what we had gobbled up in school at the time of the Cold War, right? But you know, at the same time, I said, yeah, shit, you know, like, yeah. You realize it's a liberating feeling, that you realize you're getting closer to the historical truth, to the reality, than believing in Santa Claus.
Well, that is a fantastic point to almost end on. So I'm going to take the liberty, Juan, if you'll allow me, to rephrase your question in homage to Emiliano as a yes-no question. Because I take it that the question was, are contemporary authoritarian and fascist movements instrumentalizing various figures like the foreigner or the immigrant in much the same way that Nazis were also instrumentalizing the figure of the Jew and the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy?
Well, yeah, it seems to me that's pretty obvious. There's always a need for an evil other, right? To Hitler and to Nazism, the evil other was the Jew, right? And in the context of the war on terrorism, fake terrorism, the evil other is the Arab or the Muslim. In fact, it's very similar. I think there's studies done about that compare how the Muslim or the Arab is now portrayed as in the same way that Nazis would have portrayed Jews. You know, the people that cause the trouble, because it's never us in the ideology of Nazism. We, the members of this white race, or the members of this American or Canadian or French country, we're all lucky ducks and we're all good. The trouble is, l'enfer c'est les autres, is what Jean-Paul Sartre used to say. The hell is always the other guys, you know, never us. We are all good. Even the ones that are among us that are not so wonderful, we're still great. It's just these other guys that constantly come knocking on our doors, threaten us, you know. They cause the trouble, they steal our jobs, they're lusting after our women. You know, it's them out there, not us, it's them. You know. And that is typical, that's a typical strategy that's worked. I mean, in the Middle Ages already, it was the Jew, and it was the non-believer or whatever. Yeah, so that is definitely a feature of fascism, big time, and of fascist movements and of nationalist movements. You know, like I say in Belgium, the Flemish movement, you know, basically that blames it all. Whenever goes wrong, it's those lazy balloons on the other side, right? And then within Belgium, it's those damn immigrants from Morocco that come in, on the Turks. You know, it's always great to have it before the nukes. Not us, you know. It's entre nous, everything is fine, but it's just those other guys. L'enfer, c'est les autres, is what Jean-Paul Sartre said.
Well, that's an excellent place to wrap up. Before showering you with applause, I'll just remind everyone, if anybody wants to buy a copy of this book, there's one that has my name on it. I think they're like $25, $30, $20, so they're very affordable. Otherwise, please join me in thanking Jacques Pauwels. And thank all of you for the great questions and lively attendance. We've gone over by a little bit once again, but I think it's just because it was a great conversation. Tried to pack a lot in. So thank you, have a good evening, and we will see you tomorrow at the same time. And thank you to everybody online. Take care.